Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on something you might not expect. We're looking at a career path, wearing apparel pressing, we've got some resources from RoleCatcher,
Huh.
and going through it all, it turns out there's a lot more to this job than you might think, a lot more to it than just ironing.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely a case of, where artistry meets precision. What really gets me about it is how wearing apparel pressers, how they can take something that looks, well, a little sad and totally transform it. I mean, it's all about understanding fabric, right?
Hmm.
Construction,
Yeah.
and using that heat and steam to, really make the designer's vision come alive.
See, that's interesting to me. I always thought it was a very practical skill, but what
Yeah.
you're saying is there's a real art to it.
Absolutely, yeah. Think about the difference between how you iron a t-shirt, just a cotton t-shirt, and then say you have a vintage silk gown. Like, totally different. Different techniques, different tools, even just the way you touch the fabric changes. It's all specialized. For that t-shirt, you might just grab a steam iron, but that silk gown, probably going to want a vacuum press for that. And knowing, which to choose, how to use it, that's where the real skill comes in.
So I guess it's not just putting it on high heat with a ton of steam.
Right. There's a lot more to it.
What are some of the skills that someone in this role, what are some things they need to be good at that maybe people wouldn't expect?
So first off, you got to have a good eye for detail. You're going to be inspecting garments, looking for defects. I'm talking a missed stitch or a loose thread, things most people are not even going to notice.
So they're like the guardians of quality control,
Yeah.
making sure everything is perfect before someone buys it.
Yeah, exactly. And since they work with all sorts of different fabrics, you've got silk, wool, linen, all the synthetics, they really need to know how each one reacts to the heat and pressure. I mean, what works on one fabric, it could totally ruin another.
It's a lot to keep in your head.
Oh, yeah.
Sounds like you have to be willing to learn all the time.
Constantly. This is a job where you never really stop learning. And you might be surprised to know there's even specializations within wearing apparel pressing.
Really? I had no idea. What are some of those?
Well, you could get known for being an expert in one particular type of garment. Like maybe you're the best at men's tailoring, or you're the go-to person for delicate vintage stuff.
So if someone's grandmother has a vintage wedding dress, you're the person they go to.
That's it. Or you might focus on a very specific technique, like pleating or shaping, and you'd work directly with designers on custom-made pieces. I've even heard of some pressers who only work on leather and suede, which I bet takes a lot of skill.
It's pretty amazing how much variety there is. I mean, we're talking about one job, but it seems like there are so many different directions you could go. So where do these wearing apparel pressers work?
You'll find them all over. You got garment factories where they make sure everything is good on a really large scale. Some work in dry cleaners, handling all different kinds of materials and clothes. And then you have some who work in high-end places like boutiques or tailoring shops doing alterations or custom work.
Yeah, that makes sense. Each of those would have its own pace and demands.
Totally. Yeah, a factory's probably going to be really fast-paced, focused on hitting deadlines. But then a shop that does tailoring, that's going to be more about working one-on-one with clients, really perfecting those little details.
So let's say someone wants to do this.
Yeah.
How do they get started in this field? What are those first steps?
Like a lot of hands-on jobs, experience is key. Most wearing apparel pressers, they start out by helping more seasoned people, maybe in a place like a dry cleaner or a shop that does alterations.
So you're basically jumping right in and learning from people with experience.
Right, exactly. Now, I know some vocation schools have programs for this, but most of the time, on-the-job training, that's really the best way to learn.
Okay, so for someone who's just starting out, those entry-level jobs are super important. What do they usually look like?
Well, we're probably going to start with the basics, learning how to use all the equipment, figuring out those heat settings, those are important, and then just getting the hang of handling different fabrics so you don't ruin anything.
Right, building up that foundation. It's all about the details in this job, right?
Totally. From there, you might move on to stuff that's a little more specific, like maybe you get really good at pressing a certain type of garment, or they have you help out with alterations. The important thing is to really be paying attention, always be ready to learn new things, and just take advantage of any chance you get to get better at what you do.
You got to show them you're reliable, that they can count on you. And speaking of working with others, you mentioned before that some wearing apparel pressers, they work in factories, right?
Right.
That's got to be different than working in a smaller shop.
Oh, yeah. Totally different environment. In a factory, you're usually part of this big production line, and you're just doing one specific thing, like pressing sleeves all day or working on just one part of the garment.
So it's all about speed and making sure they hit their targets.
Yep. Speed and precision.
It sounds like it could get repetitive.
It can.
But I guess there's also something kind of cool about, like, mastering a specific skill and then seeing how it fits into that bigger picture of making the whole garment.
Yeah, you get into a rhythm. You know you're part of making something high quality, and that's a good feeling. And then as you get more experience, you can move up. You might even be the one supervising a whole team of pressers.
So even in a factory, there's room to become a leader.
Absolutely. And those skills, those are valuable no matter where you work. Knowing how to manage people, how to fix problems when they come up, how to make sure everything meets the standards. You can take those skills anywhere.
That's true.
Yeah.
So it's not just about knowing how to press. It's about all these other skills you pick up along the way.
Okay, so we talked about factories, we talked about tailoring shops. What about dry cleaners? I feel like you see those everywhere, and I bet they need wearing apparel pressers.
Oh, for sure. Dry cleaners, that's another really common place to work. A lot of pressers, they start out in dry cleaners, and some of them, that's all they ever do their whole career.
I bet that comes with its own set of, good and bad things about it. What are some of the things that are really different about working in a dry cleaner?
I think one of the biggest things is just how many different types of clothes you see. I mean, you could get anything from like the stuff people wear every day to fancy formal wear to really old vintage stuff. You never know what's going to come across that pressing table.
So you got to be ready for anything.
Exactly. And you got to be able to think on your feet. Like maybe there's a stain or something shrunk in the wash, or maybe there's all this beading or sequins that you need to work around carefully.
Like a garment detective. That's a good way to put it. But it's a really good feeling when you figure it out, when you can get a piece of clothing back to looking its best.
I bet. It's like you're bringing it back to life, giving it a second chance. And I'm sure people are so happy when they get their clothes back and they look amazing.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So we've talked about a lot of the practical parts of the job, like where people work and the different things they do. But I think it's important to remember that artistic side we were talking about before.
Yeah, you said it's not just getting the wrinkles out. It's about making the garment look even better. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so a really good presser, they know how to use the heat and steam to shape the fabric, create lines where they should be to make the whole thing hang right and fit well. It's all about those details, knowing where to put a crease, where to make a soft fold so the design really stands out.
They're like artists working with fabric.
Right. They're taking what the designer imagined and bringing it to life one seam at a time.
And that artistry, that focus on the little things, I bet that's especially important when we're talking about really high-end fabrics or like vintage pieces.
Oh, absolutely. That's when you really need a delicate touch. You need to really know about the fabric and how to work with it. And a lot of times you're using these special pressing techniques.
Can you give us an example? Like what's one of those techniques that most people wouldn't even know about?
Well, there's this one called blocking. It's often used for knit things like sweaters or anything cashmere to keep them from stretching out and losing their shape. Basically, you pin the garment to this special board, shaping it exactly how you want it, and then you use steam to set the fibers in place.
So it's like molding the garment into the perfect shape.
Yeah, exactly. And if you do it right, you can't even tell it's been done. But it makes a huge difference in how the whole piece drapes and how it feels.
Like those invisible details that make all the difference. I'm curious, with all this talk about artistry and detail, what about technology? Has that changed how wearing apparel pressing is done?
That's a really good question. And while all those basic skills, those are still the same, technology has definitely had an impact. Like, we're seeing these new pressing machines, they're super high-tech, got digital controls, can really fine-tune the temperature. And vacuum presses, those have gotten better too. You can adjust the pressure settings now.
It's all about having those tools to be even more precise.
Exactly. And what it means is not only is the work a little bit easier and faster, but you can do so much more now. The level of detail and the ways you can customize things, it's amazing compared to even just a few years ago.
I wonder what else they'll come up with. But even with technology, there's always going to be something special about doing this by hand, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. That human touch, that's not going anywhere. Knowing how to work with the fabric, how to see those little details, you can't replace that.
And you mentioned before how some wearing apparel pressers, they specialize in vintage. What makes them want to work with those really old clothes?
I think it's a few things. Part of it is that historical connection. They like the idea of taking care of these beautiful things from the past.
Giving them a second life, basically.
Exactly. But it's also a challenge, right? Because with vintage, you're dealing with these delicate fabrics and these ways of constructing garments that they just don't do anymore.
So you really need to know what you're doing. It's like you have to be part historian, part detective, just to figure out the best way to press these vintage pieces.
Yeah, you could say that. With vintage, it's not just about making it look nice, it's also about making sure it lasts.
And with everybody talking about sustainable fashion and buying vintage, people who can work with these older garments, they're in demand.
Oh, without a doubt. Nowadays, people are thinking a lot more about how their clothes affect the environment, so they want to make them last longer instead of just buying new ones all the time. Wearing apparel pressers, especially the ones who know vintage, they're a huge part of making that happen.
That's so cool how something that seems kind of hidden, like people don't think about it that often, how it's actually so connected to these bigger trends.
For sure. And it shows you that taking pride in your work, having these skills that have been passed down, those things are always going to be important.
It's amazing when you think about it, something like a pressed shirt or a dress that hangs just right.
Ah,
There's so much behind it, so much history, so much skill. Makes you look at clothes a little differently.
yeah, definitely. And we've been talking about the technical stuff, but we got to talk about the people skills for a minute. People forget about those, but in this line of work, you got to be good with people. It's important.
That's so true.
Yeah.
You're not just hanging out with an iron all day.
Yeah.
So what are some of those people skills that are really important in this job?
Communication, that's a big one. It doesn't matter if you're working on a team or dealing directly with customers. You got to be able to really listen to what people are saying, and you got to be able to get your point across.
So that means being able to follow directions, but also not being afraid to ask if you're not sure about something.
Yeah.
And then explaining what you're doing so everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And honestly, patience is huge, especially when you're working with clients. They might be stressed out about a stain or need something altered last minute. You got to stay calm and help them feel like everything's going to be okay.
It's about making them feel comfortable, even when things are a little crazy.
Yep, exactly. Because at the end of the day, this is a service job. You're not just pressing clothes. You're helping people look good, feel good.
It's about that feeling of like you're making a difference for people.
100%. A lot of wearing apparel pressers, that's what they love about it, knowing they're using their skills to help people. Okay, so before we wrap up, I wanted to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the future of this industry. What do you think are some of the biggest hurdles, but also the biggest opportunities for wearing apparel pressers in the coming years?
That's a good question.
Well, like a lot of jobs these days, technology is going to be huge. Automation, digital garment care, it's already happening.
How do you think that's going to change the role of the wearing apparel presser?
I think there will always be a need for that human touch, that ability to see those little details, the way you understand how different fabrics work. You can't just program a machine to do that. But the people who are going to really succeed, they're going to be the ones who can use that technology to their advantage, adapt their skills as things change.
So it's not about being afraid of the technology. It's about figuring out how to work with it.
Exactly. And you know what else? Sustainability is going to be huge. More and more. People want to take care of their clothes in a way that's good for the planet. They want to make their clothes last longer. And wearing apparel pressers, especially if they can offer those eco-friendly services, they're going to be in high demand.
It's like they're becoming these like protectors of clothes, making sure those clothes have a long life.
Right. It's all about understanding that the choices we make, they have an impact on the environment. And then using our skills to make things better.
That's awesome. So for anyone out there listening, anyone who might be thinking about a career as a wearing apparel presser, what would you tell them?
Don't think for a second that this job is easy. It takes skill, it takes precision, and you got to be good at figuring things out. But it's a craft that's always changing, always growing. There are so many different things you can specialize in. So yeah, if you're even a little bit curious, look into it. You might be surprised at where this job can take you.
Love that. And hey, if you're serious about exploring this as a career, RoleCatcher is the place to go. Job postings, interview tips. They even have info on what it's really like to work in the industry.
Really is a great resource.
Okay.
If you want to know more about this line of work, they've got you covered.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into the world of wearing apparel pressing. Hopefully you've learned a thing or two about what goes on behind the scenes, the skill, the artistry, the people who make sure our clothes look their best.
It's been great chatting with you.
Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep it classy.